Hi, I'm Nick Seiter. I'm a field crop entomologist at the University of Illinois. Wanted to give you a status update on the corn rootworm in Illinois and what we've been seeing not just last year with management of this insect, but over the last several years with management of corn rootworm. And when you look at where we are right now, we could be at a bit of a tipping point when it comes to corn rootworm management. For the last decade or so, we've had things pretty good as far as rootworm management is concerned, especially when you compare this to what's gone on historically in Illinois. The BT trait packages that we've had have really been a godsend in terms of control for this insect. We're at a point in Illinois right now where we still have quite a bit of utility with those trait packages. In fact, they're still the best thing that we have available to us in terms of controlling this insect. However, if we're not careful with the way that we use these tools going into the future, we could find ourselves in a situation where we don't have that utility anymore, and we have to go back to some older tools that maybe we don't want to rely on for control of corn rootworm. And it's really mirroring, in some ways, the situation that we've seen over the last few decades with herbicide resistance. We don't want to be with this insect where we are with weeds right now in Illinois. But as far as things are at the moment, weed resistance is the lead dog on the sled, so to speak. But we're on that same sled when it comes to corn rootworm. We're following that same path, and if we're not careful, we could lose these tools as we go into the future. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today, one, in addition to western corn rootworm, I do want to put a little bit of emphasis on our other species of rootworm in Illinois, the northern corn rootworm, and what we've been seeing with that insect in particular over the last several years. And while this is most relevant in northern Illinois, it's not just relevant in northern Illinois, and it's something we want to be on the lookout for throughout the state. I do want to talk a little bit about the BT traits that we have, the individual proteins and the packages that we have, and the relationships among those traits, and a little bit about how some of those proteins are the same, but also a little bit about some differences that we see there, and how those similarities and differences are relevant in terms of management. Now, I especially want to spend some time talking about our current observations around the state and what we've been seeing, what we saw in 2020, and how that maybe differs from what we had seen over the last few years. And finally, management recommendations, taking into account some of the resistance issues that we've been seeing, but also taking into account some of the low overall populations of rootworms that we've been seeing in Illinois, at least when you compare this to historical averages. One thing I want to point out to you at the beginning, there's another session in this program, a talk given by my colleague, Dr. Joe Spencer, Western Corn Rootworm Biology and Resistance Management. I would really encourage you to check out that session in addition to this one. Joe is going to give a very thorough overview of Western corn rootworm, in particular biology, but also the resistance status of that insect based on bioassays that he's conducted around the state. And you'll see a similar situation with these bioassays to what we've been seeing in terms of field efficacy, in that we're not falling off a cliff, so to speak. We're not successful, all of a sudden losing all of our efficacy with these tools. We're gradually losing just a little bit of efficacy every year. We're sliding just a little bit more and more every year, and that's what these bioassays show, and that's what our reports from the field are showing. Now, a lot of this damage is occurring below ground, so it's hidden from us. But it's out there, and it's something I would encourage you to be on the lookout for on your own farms. Even if it looks like it above ground, you're not going from fine to a problem overnight. We're taking some time to get there. That means we have some time to alleviate that problem, but it's going to take a little more careful attention to what's going on in your fields, both in terms of adult numbers and in terms of damage below the ground. Now, of course, we're all familiar with western corn rootworm and northern corn rootworm. These two insects make up the most economically important pest complex in corn in Illinois, and in fact throughout the Corn Belt. Depending on where you are, you may have more northern corn rootworm, you may have more western corn rootworm. Historically in Illinois, we've had more problems with the western corn rootworm, and that remains our most important species. However, in recent years we have been seeing a little more from the northern corn rootworm, especially in northern Illinois. Now, when we look at, of course, the damage that these insects do, when we look at the overall life cycle of these insects, they're quite similar. Both go through one generation per year, typically. Both feed solely on corn as a larva, or on corn and a few related species of grasses. Both are actually capable, at least in parts of their distribution, of overcoming crop rotation as a management tool. Now, the mechanism by which they overcome this rotation is completely different. With the western corn rootworm, you have an insect that has evolved to actually lay its eggs into soybean and other non-crop hosts, in addition to corn. So all of those eggs are going to hatch the following spring. Those eggs that hatch into soybean are going to die. Those larvae will starve to death. Even if it's a rotation-resistant population, those larvae have no tolerance for soybean or for other broadleaf plants. However, those larvae that hatch into corn will feed and survive. And so in a sort of a bet hedging strategy, the adult western corn rootworm lays its eggs not just in corn, but in soybean as well. And that's how it's been able to overcome crop rotation as a management tactic in parts of its distribution. With the northern corn rootworm, these insects are also capable of overcoming crop rotation. They do this by an extended diapause. So when those eggs are laid during the summer, they need to go through a cold period, a winter, before they will hatch. And with the northern corn rootworm, a certain percentage of those eggs will hatch after year 1, which is the natural behavior, the natural situation. However, a proportion of those eggs are going to hatch after year 2. A proportion of those eggs will hatch in year 3. A proportion of those eggs will hatch in year 4. It's another bet hedging strategy, right? But a certain percentage of those eggs, where they're able to go through that extended diapause, will then hatch into corn if you're in a corn-soybean rotation. And of course, even if you're in a corn-soybean rotation, you'll still have a percentage of those eggs hatching into that cornfield. And when we look at northern corn rootworm overall, just in terms of its biology, very similar, again, to western. They do tend to emerge a little bit later than western corn rootworm. One difference here with the wild type, the adults are a little more polyphagous. The adults will feed on a wider variety of plants, and especially a wider variety of pollen. It's not uncommon, for instance, to find large numbers of these adults in patches of giant ragweed, if you're someone that can walk through patches of giant ragweed. I'm not, I've just heard legends of that. But they're attracted to the pollen of a wider variety of plants than western corn rootworm adults are. Another place you may find northern corn rootworm adults, they're actually a fairly severe pest of cut flowers. They do like to feed on the blooms of zinnias and several other cut flowers, and so they've actually been a pretty miserable pest to deal with in certain cut flower operations. Of course, the damage that northern corn rootworm does is going to be exactly the same. They're not going to do any different damage from western corn rootworm, you're not going to look at that damage below the ground and be able to distinguish one insect from another. One key difference with the northern corn rootworm that's starting to come into play in our management operations, from day one, northern corn rootworm has been just a little less susceptible to the BT traits that we have available for control than the western corn rootworm. Now, in previous years, this hasn't been a problem because our complex has been dominated by western. But in recent years, we have seen northern corn rootworm sneaking in from those northern states. Of course, it's called northern corn rootworm. It is a little more cold tolerant than the western corn rootworm. They see higher levels of this insect in comparison, in relation to western corn rootworm up in the Dakotas, for instance. In recent years, they've been seeing more issues with northern corn rootworm in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in northern Iowa. And that is starting to sneak into northern Illinois. We're seeing that insect move further and further south. The exact reasons of that we're not sure of, but we have a pretty strong inclination that part of that has to do with their tolerance to these BT traits. There's some interesting interactions between these two species as well. Northern corn rootworm in many cases seems to get sort of pushed out of an area when western corn rootworm comes into that area. That's actually what happened in Illinois decades ago when the western corn rootworm first arrived in Illinois back in the 60s. They actually sort of pushed northern corn rootworm further north. They sort of outcompeted northern corn rootworm in that geography. Kind of an interesting situation. But we are starting to see a few more northerns in Illinois, and that's something you need to be on the lookout for in your operation. Again, primarily in northern Illinois, that's where we've seen higher numbers of northern corn rootworm. Makes sense, of course. Name's a nice reminder for you there. We did see in a few cases in corn-on-corn fields in particular some fairly high northern populations down in southern Illinois this last year. Only in a couple of cases, but something to keep a lookout for regardless of where you're at in Illinois, and especially in continuous cornfields. Now, one thing, we all know what this damage looks like at the end of the season. This is when we're often seeing this damage. This is what we really want to avoid, is this lodging that both species of corn rootworm, sorry about that alarm there, it's noon. Both species of corn rootworm can cause this lodging damage, and that's what we want to avoid. One thing I do want to point out to you from the beginning here, when you look at this lodging, you can actually have a fair amount of pruning before you see this lodging, depending on the soil conditions, depending on moisture, depending on, usually not the wind. We usually get a wind in Illinois that's sufficient to knock these over, although that derecho that we had this last year did reveal some corn rootworm problems when that came through. But just because you don't have lodging does not necessarily mean you don't have a problem, and especially as we'll discuss in a little bit of detail here later, doesn't mean that you don't have a problem developing below the soil. And so when we look at the current status of corn rootworm in Illinois, what we're really concerned with is this development of resistance to the various BT traits that we have. That's a situation that we've been in for several years with the initial traits that were released, the Cry3 traits, Yield Guard, and so forth, and that more recently we've become aware of with Cry34, 35. So when you look in Illinois right now, we have resistance to those Cry3 traits, and by those I mean Yield Guard, Cry3BB1, the original AgriSure rootworm trait, mCry3A, and the second trait that's been added to Duracade, eCry3.1AB. Those are the proteins involved. This resistance is fairly common in Illinois. We can't say that it's everywhere in Illinois. Particularly, we're curious how much resistance there is in southern Illinois, where we haven't had much selection. It is just about everywhere that we've looked. Everywhere where we've looked for resistance with a bioassay, we've found it to these three traits. One thing to point out with Cry3BB1, with mCry3A, with eCry3.1AB, they share very similar modes of action, very similar sites of action. Because of that, when you have resistance to one of these proteins, you have at least partial resistance to all three. There's a higher degree of cross-resistance among these different proteins. Now, Cry3435 has more of a unique mode of action, more of a unique site of action. And so you don't see those same levels of cross-resistance with this protein. Now, resistance to Cry3435 was recently confirmed in northern Iowa. Of course, it seems to be fairly widespread in Iowa. It's here that we're gradually losing susceptibility with this trait. It's not nearly as widespread as resistance to the Cry3 traits, but it's here, and we've got just a little bit more of it every year. That's something to keep an eye out for, certainly, and that's one of our major concerns here, is that we're really relying a lot on this individual protein to keep those pyramided hybrids functioning. Now, just to add insult to injury, we have confirmed recently, our colleagues have confirmed resistance in the northern corn rootworm to both those Cry3 proteins and Cry3435. That's been confirmed in North Dakota. It's strongly suspected elsewhere, and I can tell you it's present elsewhere. It's just difficult to confirm this in the laboratory. That's on top of the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the northern corn rootworm was just a little bit less susceptible to these proteins on day one. It's taken it a little bit longer to develop true resistance to these, but it's here. So this insect is a threat as well, not just to corn on corn in general, but to our traded corn. Now, just a reminder here, we're no longer putting these proteins out individually. If you still somehow got a single trait hybrid, it's probably a forage hybrid or something, but if you're in a geography where corn rootworm is a problem, you should strongly consider not using a single trait hybrid there. In fact, those are being phased out, and for the most part, they're not available. We only have pyramided hybrids available when it comes to corn rootworm management. This is what the primary trait packages look like. Most of these are going to have a Cry3 trait, which you can see here, 3BB1, or perhaps Cry3A, in combination with Cry3435. Now, of course, when you look at this list, and you consider the fact that we have resistance to those Cry3s, to 3BB1, to Cry3A, and Cry 3.1AB, fairly widespread in Illinois, we're putting a lot of pressure on 3435 for these pyramids to continue to function. Now, in order to keep track of these, I do strongly recommend you take a look at the handy BT trait table that my colleagues put out. I'll have a link for that at the end of this talk, but that can really help you to keep these different trait packages separate and to be able to look at those trait packages and decide what are the similarities and what are the differences among these different proteins in this different package. And one thing to point out here, when we think about resistance management tactics, rotating your BT trait package as a resistance management tactic really isn't much of an option for us anymore. All of these BT trait packages have a strong degree of overlap in terms of their mode of action. So that's just something to keep in mind, keep in your back pocket when you're making these decisions. Now in 2020, and this is not terribly surprising, we did see more reports of damage to pyramided hybrids than we've been seeing in previous years. We also saw a little higher numbers of adults in 2020 than we've seen in previous years in parts of the state. In particular, where we look at this, the hot spot for Illinois, and it comes up this way in our survey, it comes up this way in the various seed company sticky trapping programs that are out there. This is where we're seeing these issues concentrated, is up in northwestern Illinois in particular, and in particular in areas where we have a lot of continuous corn production. That's not to say they were limited to northwestern Illinois, not by a long shot. We saw issues elsewhere. We saw issues over in northeastern Illinois. We saw issues just north of Bloomington in some cases. We saw some issues in terms of rootworm pressure. Now, not in terms of resistance, but in terms of rootworm pressure down in southern Illinois in continuous cornfields this last year. And that's something just to remind those of you in southern Illinois. You're in pretty good shape down there in rotated corn. You've always been in good shape in rotated corn in southern Illinois. But if you grow continuous corn, and especially if you grow continuous corn year after year after year, eventually the rootworms will find you. They're not going to find every field, and by all means, you do not need to treat every continuous cornfield in southern Illinois for corn rootworm. Not at all, okay? We've still got a lot of low populations down in that part of the state. But you do need to realize that if you continue to grow continuous corn, even in southern Illinois, you can end up with a problem over time. Now, I want to share some results with you from some field studies we did, see if I can get my counties right, up here in Monmouth, Illinois this last year, looking at the field performance of these hybrids. Now, this is a trial that we did at our research farm in Monmouth, Illinois this last year. And at first glance, it doesn't look like much. In fact, it's not a very good trial in terms of pressure. When we look at these rootworm trials, we really want the pruning in these non-BT checks to be up around here, to be up around 1.5, at least 1, to consider it a good trial and to give us a good evaluation of differences among these different treatments. And you'll see up there's no significant difference among these treatments. So why am I showing this to you? I mean, we have trials that aren't that great all the time in the rootworm world. It's tough to get a good trial on this insect sometimes. Well, here's the problem. 0.5, so half a node of roots pruned, is a level of unexpected damage for a pyramided BT hybrid. And if you look, we've got the non-BT checks right at that. We've got these two pyramided hybrids getting kind of uncomfortably close to that level. And that's not something we're used to seeing in an environment, a pressure environment that's that low. And if I look at a trial in the same spot last year, for instance, you see about the same level of pressure in these non-BT traits. You see about that same level of pruning in a single trait hybrid, an older single trait hybrid. You got barely anything in these pyramided trait packages. And that, I was just pointing at the wrong screen there, sorry about that, but these are the pyramided package and these are the non-BT traits over here. And so to be seeing this kind of pruning, again, this isn't a great experiment, but it does give us a word of caution as far as what might be going on out there in the field in some of these fields that aren't really showing much in terms of rootworm damage, particularly above ground. This is not a trial when we're seeing this level of pruning. This is not a trial where we would be seeing any sort of lodging, certainly, and probably no yield reduction. We did not see yield reduction in this particular trial, at least not associated with rootworm damage. And so this is that kind of sneaking up that I was talking about earlier. We're not losing susceptibility right away. We're losing a little bit every year. It's creeping up on us. And the concern is that if we have a year coming up where we have larger rootworm numbers over a larger area, we're going to find that we're in a worse position than we think we are in some cases in terms of resistance development, even in these pyramided BT hybrids. So that's something I really want you to be vigilant on and really want you to be watching your fields. You know, watch certainly for increases in rootworm population density. Dig a few roots as well. I'm not saying go dig roots in every field that you've got, but maybe dig some roots in every trait package that you're looking. And just look below ground and see what kind of pruning you're seeing. Because again, this is a problem that develops over time. But if you wait until the corn falls over, you're going to see it happen all at once, even though it's been a long time coming. So with that, what are the management recommendations, in terms of preventing this rootworm damage or this resistance development? The only option that we have is to try to reduce the selection pressure on these tools. And what that comes down to is putting these tools out where they're needed. Now, the way we make that decision isn't great, and unfortunately this isn't live, so I can't see your eyes rolling out in the audience. This is not a great tool, right? It's not a fun tool to use, but it's the only tool we've got in terms of measuring these adult populations accurately, and it's something I would encourage you to consider. One of the good things we have going on right now in the industry is a lot of the seed companies are being proactive about this monitoring, and we have a lot of regional monitoring programs that can show you certainly where the hot spots are in the state of Illinois. And if you look across these maps this last year, they all agreed northwestern Illinois was a hot spot as far as rootworm pressure. Now within those regions, there's a lot of variability from field to field, and in particular what I'll point out to you, in soybean, so in soybean that's going into corn, pretty low pressure for most of the state, and there's still a lot of opportunity if you're going to save on these trait packages, if you're going to hold off on some of this. Rotated corn is where you should do it, but you need to do it based on actual numbers out in the field. If we look at these as a predictive tool, so predicting the need for management next year, we've got an economic threshold for first year corn following soybeans, of 1.5 beetles per trap per day. That's at the period of peak beetle activity. It's typically going to be in late July, early August, might be a little bit later than that in some cases. In corn on corn, that's a threshold of 2 beetles per trap per day. And I think for those of you up in northern Illinois, I don't think very many of you are going to grow continuous corn without rootworm protection in that part of the state. In southern Illinois, where we've got still relatively low populations overall, still a relatively low threat to continuous corn, I would encourage you down there, if you are growing continuous corn, to take a look at this and see what your beetle populations are, and especially to make sure you catch them before they start hitting that critical level, which is probably going to be, it might be in year 3, year 4 of the rotation. But certainly they can catch you off guard even in southern Illinois. But pay attention to this, and the other great use for these tools is if you can track beetle emergence as they're coming out of the ground, you can get an idea based on the number of beetles that are produced as to how much survival there is in whatever trait package you happen to be using. That's what you can get from these early on in that period of beetle activity, and typically early July, first or second week of July. Now, in terms of our control options, one thing that we're not getting right now is new control options, right? And that's why preserving those that we have becomes so important. Pyramided Bt hybrid is still the most effective control throughout most of the state. We're starting to lose some susceptibility there. I'm not sitting here telling you that we don't have susceptibility out there. We do throughout most of the state, but we're losing just a little bit every year. But where you have a population that needs to be controlled, these are still the most effective control that we have, and especially the most effective control that we have for limiting those adult populations after they come out. Keep in mind that soil insecticides are still a viable option. You're not going to get the same reduction in that population from these. What you do get is an alternative mode of action to where you're not just throwing Bt after Bt after Bt at them all the time. One thing I'll point out to you, I get asked a lot about soil insecticides as a resistance management tool on top of a traded hybrid. And the issue with that is very often this is coming into play after resistance is already developed, after there's already a problem field, throwing an insecticide on top of that Bt trait. And while you might, and in fact you very likely will, get better performance in terms of reduced pruning from that tool, really difficult to consider it a management tool, a resistance management tool at that point. Once that resistance to that BT trait is already there, now you're just selecting for additional resistance to that insecticide, which is a problem that we also face, and that they're sort of staring down in Nebraska right now. So what about once you already have resistance? What can you do in that situation? Best option is to rotate the soybean and to incorporate as much rotation in that system as you can. We've seen over and over again the first places that we're going to see resistance is in areas where we have a lot of continuous corn. Now, unfortunately, it's not the only place. The pattern we saw with Cry3 was we saw resistance first in those continuous corn areas, and then it spread out to where we have rotated fields, where we have rotation resistance as well. Currently, we're really only seeing problems with pyramided hybrids in continuous corn acres. But of course, we expect that to change over time, and we're concerned that that could change over time. Your next best option in terms of resistance management is going to be to rotate to a soil insecticide. If you have to have corn in that field, a soil insecticide would be the best situation in terms of resistance management there. What's the worst case? I think you all know what the worst case scenario is. It's what, in many cases, we've been doing, and that's continuing to grow corn year after year after year in that same field with that same trait package. Now, there's a lot of reasons to do that, a lot of economic reasons to do that, but in terms of BT resistance, we're absolutely driving that problem with this practice, and that's something that we want to go away from any place that we can. One thing, just a point I'll leave you with, we've seen over and over that local practices have a demonstrated impact on corn rootworm resistance management. At least initially, you're going to reap what you sow in terms of your practices as far as developing these problem fields. And so you can make an impact on your farm by incorporating more rotation, by incorporating more of an IPM approach and initiating these controls where they're needed. And the time to start doing that is now. It's not after the problem has developed. With that, I did want to share several links for resources related to this. We'll have a 2020 report of our applied research results out soon. Hopefully in January or February that'll be available. This is the link to the 2019 version. Again, I recommend that handy BT trait table if you want to look at the makeup of these different trait packages that are available. And finally, at this Crop Central site is where we're putting our extension information, our production information related to integrated pest management and entomology and field crops. With that, thank you for your time. Thank you for participating in this session. And if you have any questions for me, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email, give me a call, shoot me a text, get a hold of me on Twitter, however you want to do it. Thank you.